The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Prescott as Frances Mitchell adjusted her bonnet and smoothed her dark blue dress. Even after 5 years, she still carried herself with the rigid posture learned during her days gathering intelligence behind enemy lines. Old habits died hard, especially when they'd kept you alive. The small Arizona Territory town had grown significantly since she'd arrived 2 years ago, bringing with it an influx of settlers looking to start fresh after the war, including many former Confederates. Through the window of her modest general store, Frances watched Alexander Turner lead his cattle down the street toward the stockyards. He'd arrived 6 months ago from Georgia with bitter memories and a burning desire to build something new. Like many others, he didn't know her past, and she preferred to keep it that way. The war had left deep wounds that were still healing, and her role as a Union spy was better left buried in the past. The bell above the door chimed as Helen Roberts entered, her young son Jacob trailing behind. "Frances, have you heard? The railroad survey crew finally arrived. They're saying the line might come right through Prescott." Helen's excitement was palpable, but Frances felt a knot form in her stomach. More attention meant more people, and more chances someone might recognize her from her days in Richmond. The store had become Frances's sanctuary, a place where she could build a new life far from the shadows and secrets of war. Every shelf was meticulously organized, from the rows of canned goods to the stacks of fabric and leather goods. The familiar scent of coffee beans and tobacco helped ground her when memories threatened to overwhelm. She'd chosen this location carefully, close enough to watch the street but with a back door that offered a quick escape if needed. Benjamin Phillips, the town's only doctor, stepped in as Helen was leaving. His eyes held that knowing look that always made Frances uneasy. During the war, he'd served as a Confederate field surgeon, and something in the way he studied her suggested he might have crossed paths with her before, but he'd never said anything directly, maintaining a cordial professional distance that left her constantly wondering. The land dispute that had been brewing between the cattle ranchers and the incoming railroad interests was reaching a boiling point. Frances had heard whispers of secret meetings, of plans to resist the survey crew's work. Alexander Turner and his fellow ranchers saw the railroad as a threat to their way of life, while others in town welcomed the promise of progress and prosperity it would bring. Clara Perez, whose family had ranched the area for generations before the war, came in looking troubled. "Frances, there's talk of forcing the survey crew out. Turner and his men are riling people up saying we can't let outsiders take what's ours." The irony wasn't lost on Frances. She'd heard similar rhetoric in Virginia, right before everything fell apart. She nodded sympathetically while mentally cataloging which supplies she might need to stock in case of trouble. As dusk approached, Frances spotted Noah Mitchell, no relation, though the shared surname had helped her establish her cover story, riding hard into town. The young deputy's face was grim as he dismounted outside the sheriff's office. Something had happened out on the plains, and Frances felt the familiar tension rising in her chest. She'd learned during the war to trust her instincts, and right now they were screaming that her carefully constructed peace was about to shatter. The last customer of the day was Ethan Turner, Alexander's younger brother, who lingered longer than necessary while purchasing ammunition. His casual questions about how long she'd been in Arizona Territory carried an edge that made her pulse quicken. She answered with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent years maintaining a cover, but inside her mind was racing. Had someone finally recognized her? Was her past catching up with her? As she locked up for the night, Frances caught a glimpse of her reflection in the window. The setting sun painted the glass in shades of amber and gold, briefly transforming her practical storekeep's attire into something resembling the fine dresses she'd worn while moving through Richmond's high society, gathering information that would help turn the tide of war. She quickly turned away from the memory, but not before noticing Benjamin Phillips watching her from across the street, his expression unreadable in the growing darkness. Frances hurried through her closing routine, her mind churning with the implications of Turner's visit and Phillips' watchful presence. The store's wooden floorboards creaked beneath her feet as she moved inventory and checked the ledger one final time. Through the years, she'd learned to trust her instincts, the same ones that had kept her alive during countless dangerous missions. And right now, they were screaming that her carefully constructed life in Prescott was about to unravel. The walk home took her past the Cattlemen's Association building, where several riders were gathering for their evening meeting. Among them was Noah Barrett, whose sprawling ranch north of town employed most of the former Confederate soldiers who'd settled in the area. Frances kept her head down, but not before noticing Alexander Turner dismounting his horse, his conversation with the others falling silent as she passed. The weight of their stares felt like physical pressure against her back. Inside her modest home on the outskirts of town, Frances lit the lamps and moved through the familiar routine of preparing evening tea. The ceramic cup trembled slightly in her hands as she remembered the last time she'd been recognized. 3 years ago in Globe. She'd been forced to abandon everything and start fresh here in Prescott. The thought of doing it again made her chest tighten with exhaustion and grief. A knock at the door startled her from her reverie. Through the window, she caught sight of Clara Barrett, Noah's wife, standing on her porch. The two women had developed a cautious friendship over shared interest in the town's small library, but Clara's presence at this hour was unusual. Frances opened the door, noting the worry etched across her friend's features. "I've come to warn you," Clara said without preamble, stepping inside and lowering her voice. "There was talk at the social circle today. Helen Turner's been receiving letters from her cousin in Richmond. She claims—" Clara hesitated, twisting her hands together. "She claims to have information about a Union spy who matches your description." Frances maintained her composure, though her heart hammered against her ribs. Helen Turner, Alexander and Ethan's sister-in-law, had always been coolly polite during their few interactions. But now Frances understood the calculating looks the woman had given her. "That must be unsettling news for everyone," she said carefully, "given how many people came west to leave the war behind." Clara's expression softened with sympathy. "Noah's called a meeting tonight. Not just the Cattlemen's Association, others too. I shouldn't even be here, but—" She reached for Frances's hand. "You saved Alice's life when she had the fever last winter. I couldn't let them." She trailed off, leaving the implications hanging in the air. Frances squeezed Clara's hand, genuine gratitude mixing with strategic calculation. Having Barrett's wife as an ally could prove crucial in the coming days. "Thank you for the warning. I assume they'll want to investigate these claims thoroughly before taking any action." The question was pointed. She needed to know how much time she had. "Alexander Turner's riding to Flagstaff tomorrow," Clara replied, understanding the real question. "He's telegraphing contacts in Virginia for confirmation. But Ethan?" She shook her head. "He's always been the hot-headed one. I don't think he'll wait for proof." After Clara left, Frances moved through her house with practiced efficiency, gathering essential items and documents she'd kept ready for just such an emergency. But as she reached for the false bottom drawer containing her emergency funds, she hesitated. Running again would mean abandoning not just her business, but the life she'd built here. The first place since the war where she'd allowed herself to put down real roots. Through her window, she could see the lights of the Cattlemen's Association building, where men who had once been her enemies were likely now discussing her fate. But they weren't her enemies anymore. They were her neighbors, her customers, people whose children she'd helped teach to read in the Sunday school. The war had ended years ago, but its shadows still stretched across the plains, dark and long in the setting sun. Frances made her decision. She wouldn't run, not this time, but she would need allies, and quickly. Benjamin Phillips's strange behavior earlier took on new significance. As a former Union cavalry officer who'd also chosen to make a new life here, he might understand her position better than most. Tomorrow, she would seek him out. Tonight, she had preparations to make. As dawn broke over the prairie grass, Frances methodically checked her small arsenal. A Remington Derringer tucked in her boot, a Spencer carbine hidden beneath loose floorboards, and her father's old Navy Colt secured in her desk drawer. The weapons were relics of her wartime days, maintained but unused since she'd opened her mercantile. The familiar weight of the Colt brought back memories of close calls and midnight rides through Confederate territory, carrying intelligence that had saved countless Union lives. The morning air held an unusual chill as she made her way down the dusty main street toward Benjamin Phillips' law office. A few early risers nodded cautiously in her direction, their greetings noticeably cooler than yesterday's. Word traveled fast in small towns, and she could feel the change in the atmosphere as surely as an approaching storm. Benjamin's office was a modest wooden structure wedged between the barbershop and the hardware store. Through the window, she could see him already at his desk, his silver-streaked hair catching the morning light. The dust-laden wind carried whispers through Prescott's crowded streets as Anna Mitchell made her way to the land office, her heart pounding beneath her high-collared blouse. 3 years had passed since the war's end, but the weight of her wartime activities still pressed heavily upon her conscience. She'd chosen this remote Arizona town hoping to leave that life behind, but fate had other plans when she recognized Alexander Turner among the town's newest arrivals, a former Confederate officer who'd lost his entire command due to intelligence she'd provided to Union forces. Frances Roberts, the local banker's wife and Anna's closest friend in Prescott, hurried to catch up with her on the boardwalk. "Anna, have you heard? The Turner family just purchased the old Phillips Ranch. They're saying Alexander Turner plans to run 5,000 head of cattle on that land." The news made Anna's blood run cold. The Phillips Ranch bordered her own modest spread, where she'd been quietly building a new life. The land office was unusually busy that morning, filled with the acrid smell of tobacco smoke and heated discussions about water rights. Benjamin Mitchell, no relation to Anna despite the shared surname, stood behind his desk examining paperwork with his wire-rimmed spectacles perched precariously on his nose. As the territory's land commissioner, he held considerable sway over property disputes, which had been increasing as more settlers arrived seeking their fortunes. Anna waited patiently while studying a large map on the wall, noting how the Turner purchase effectively surrounded her small homestead on 3 sides. The fourth border was Prescott Creek, which had been running low this season. She didn't need her wartime intelligence training to recognize a tactical maneuver when she saw one. Turner was positioning himself to control her water access. "Miss Mitchell," Benjamin called out, finally free from his other visitors. "I received your inquiry about expanding your water rights. I'm afraid there's been a complication." He shuffled through some papers, avoiding her eyes. "The Turner claim predates yours by 3 days. They've filed for exclusive rights to Prescott Creek's western branch." Anna felt the room spin slightly as she processed the implications. Outside the land office, Frances took Anna's arm as they walked toward the general store. "There's more," she whispered. "Helen Turner, Alexander's wife. She's been asking questions about you around town. Specific questions about where you came from, what you did during the war." The two women exchanged knowing looks. Frances had been the only person Anna had trusted with her past, and now that trust seemed more valuable than ever. That evening, as Anna rode the fence line of her property, she spotted riders in the distance. 3 men on Turner's side of the boundary. Through her field glasses, she recognized Alexander Turner's distinctive white hat. The other 2 were strangers, but their military bearing was unmistakable. Former soldiers, no doubt, and likely ones who'd served under Turner during the war. Clara Phillips, whose family had sold their ranch to Turner, visited Anna's homestead the next morning with a warning. "They found Confederate dispatches in my father's old trunk, documents from '63 that mentioned a female spy operating in Virginia. Turner's been obsessed with them since the war. He believes that spy cost him everything: his command, his family plantation, his honor. He's convinced she fled west." The pieces were falling into place with terrible clarity. Turner hadn't chosen this location by chance. Somehow he'd tracked her here. The water rights dispute was just a pretense, a legal means to apply pressure while he gathered proof of her identity. Anna had spent years developing her cover as a quiet widow from Pennsylvania. But one slip, one person who remembered her face from Virginia, could unravel everything. Noah Roberts, Frances's teenage son, rode up to Anna's fence line in a cloud of dust. "Miss Mitchell, there's trouble in town, Mr. Turner's men are asking about a woman named Alice who worked as a nurse in Richmond during the war. They're showing around an old tintype photograph." Anna's stomach clenched. She had worked under that name in the Confederate capital, treating wounded soldiers while gathering intelligence about troop movements. As evening approached, Anna sat at her kitchen table cleaning her father's old Colt revolver. She'd hoped never to need it again after the war, but the weight of it felt familiar in her hands. Through the window, she could see dust rising from the road, riders approaching. The time for hiding behind carefully constructed lies was coming to an end. She would have to face her past and find a way to survive it, just as she had during the war. Jacob Perez, her nearest neighbor and one of the few Mexican ranchers in the area, appeared at her door just before sunset. "Senorita Mitchell, Turner's men were at my ranch today. They offered good money for information about you, but I told them nothing. My father taught me that loyalty to a good neighbor is worth more than gold." His words touched her deeply. She'd helped his family during a difficult winter, never expecting anything in return. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Frances arrived breathless at Anna's door, clutching a telegram. Turner's wife, Helen. She recognized your handwriting on the water rights petition. She was a nurse at Chimborazo Hospital in Richmond, same time you were there as Alice. Anna's mind raced through possibilities, remembering the quiet woman who had worked in the surgical ward. She'd never suspected Helen had such a sharp memory for detail. Anna's hands trembled as she poured coffee for Frances and Jacob, her mind calculating the implications of Helen Turner's recognition. The morning sun cast long shadows through her kitchen window, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the air. She'd chosen this remote stretch of plains between Prescott and Globe specifically because it seemed unlikely anyone would connect her current identity with her wartime role. There's more, Frances continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. Helen's brother was executed as a spy in '64 after information from someone matching your description reached Union forces. She's convinced you were responsible. The weight of those years pressed down on Anna's shoulders. She remembered that case. The brother had been running weapons through civilian supply lines, using a hospital as cover. Her intelligence had saved countless Union lives, but at what cost? Jacob stood by the window, his weathered face grave as he watched the horizon. Turner's men are spreading out across the valley. They've been asking questions at every ranch between here and Flagstaff. He turned to Anna, his dark eyes concerned. This isn't just about the water rights anymore. They're building a case against you, trying to turn the whole territory against a Union spy. The plains stretched endlessly outside, the tall grass rippling in waves under the morning breeze. Anna had learned to love this open country, so different from the close-kept secrets of Richmond's wartime streets. She'd built something here, a small herd of cattle, connections with neighbors like Jacob and Frances, a life free from the shadows of her past. Now that past was threatening everything she'd worked for. Benjamin Walsh rides with Turner now, Frances added, referring to the former Confederate cavalry officer who'd settled north of Prescott. He's been telling anyone who'll listen about a female spy who cost them the battle at Cold Harbor. Anna's stomach clenched. She hadn't known Walsh had survived that engagement. Her intelligence about Confederate positions had indeed helped turn that battle, but the cost in lives still haunted her dreams. Jacob pulled a folded paper from his vest. There's talk of calling a territory meeting in Prescott. Turner's gathering supporters, ranchers who lost family in the war, men who still carry Confederate bitterness. They'll use the water rights dispute as cover, but they mean to drive you out. His voice carried the weight of experience with such meetings that often ended in violence. Anna crossed to her father's old trunk, hidden beneath years of accumulated ranch life. Inside lay the proof of her wartime service, coded messages, commendations from Union generals, and most importantly, pardons for those she'd helped escape Confederate justice. She'd kept them as insurance, never truly believing she'd need them. I won't run, she said finally. This land is my home now, and I won't let them hurt innocent people in their quest for revenge. Frances moved to stand beside her, their shoulders touching in silent support. Clara Thompson at the Prescott Telegraph office is sympathetic. She's been watching the messages going between Turner and his allies. They're planning something for the next full moon, when the cattle drives usually pass through the valley. The timing wasn't accidental. Disrupting the drives would pressure every rancher in the territory to take sides. We need to reach Alexander Morton, Jacob suggested, naming the territory's federal marshal. He fought for the Union, but he's earned respect from both sides since the war. If Turner's group moves against you illegally, Morton could intervene. Anna nodded slowly, remembering the steady-eyed marshal from previous visits to Prescott. He might understand the complicated choices of wartime better than most. As her friends prepared to leave, Anna studied the land she'd come to love. The morning sun had burned away the shadows, leaving the plains bright and clear to the horizon. Whatever came next, she would face it in the open, not in the shadows of espionage. She had survived the war by being smarter and quicker than her enemies. Now she would need all those skills again, not to spy or deceive, but to protect her home and the peace she'd found here. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Prescott's dusty main street as Anna Mitchell crouched behind an overturned wagon, her heart pounding against her ribs. The mob of angry ranchers had grown to nearly 30 men, their shouts echoing between the weathered buildings as they demanded she face Confederate justice for her wartime activities. A bullet splintered the wood near her head, making her flinch. Helen Turner, the young schoolteacher who'd become Anna's closest friend in town, was trapped in the general store with several other townsfolk. Through the window, Anna could see the fear on their faces as Alexander Phillips and his men kept them hostage, threatening to burn the building unless Anna surrendered herself. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd come west to escape her past, only to have it catch up in spectacular fashion. Benjamin Roberts, the town's aging sheriff, had tried to maintain order when the truth about Anna's wartime espionage first emerged. But he lay unconscious now in the jail after Phillips's men had overwhelmed him. His deputy, Jacob Perez, was nowhere to be seen, having ridden out that morning to investigate reports of cattle rustling. Anna was effectively alone against a town that had suddenly turned hostile. The land dispute that had brought everything to a head seemed almost trivial now. Anna had discovered that Phillips and his associates had been forging land deeds, stealing property from legitimate homesteaders by exploiting loopholes in territorial law. When she'd gathered evidence to expose them, they'd retaliated by revealing her past as a Union spy who'd operated in Virginia during the war. Frances Roberts, the sheriff's daughter, had managed to slip away during the initial chaos. She'd promised to ride for help from the cavalry unit stationed at Fort Whipple, but Anna knew they wouldn't arrive for hours. The sound of breaking glass drew her attention back to the general store, where Phillips's men were now throwing oil lamps inside. The threat to burn it wasn't idle after all. "You've got 5 minutes, Mitchell," Phillips's voice boomed across the street. "Show yourself, or we light it up with everyone inside." The former Confederate officer's face was twisted with a hatred that went beyond mere land disputes. Anna had testified against his brother at a military tribunal after the war, leading to his execution for war crimes. This was personal for him. Clara Phillips, Alexander's wife, pushed through the crowd toward her husband. Anna had often taken tea with Clara, never suspecting the woman's own connection to her past. Now Clara grabbed Alexander's arm, pleading with him to stop before things went too far. He shoved her roughly aside, his focus entirely on his revenge. Several other townsfolk began to look uncertain, seeing their respected neighbor transformed by rage. Making her decision, Anna checked her revolver. 4 bullets remained. Not nearly enough for a fight, but perhaps enough for what she had planned. She pulled the small tin star from her pocket, the one Sheriff Roberts had secretly deputized her with weeks ago when they'd begun investigating the land fraud. Its weight felt significant in her palm, a symbol of the law she'd fought to uphold both during the war and after. "Last chance, Mitchell," Phillips called out. "These deaths will be on your head." The smell of lamp oil grew stronger as more was splashed inside the store. Anna could hear children crying among the hostages now. Helen's voice rose above the others, trying to calm them even as her own fear showed through. The sun had dropped lower, painting the scene in shades of blood and gold. Standing slowly, Anna emerged from behind the wagon with her hands raised. "I'm here, Alexander," she called out clearly. "But before you kill me, these people deserve to know the truth about who's really stealing their land." She began walking forward, her star badge glinting. The crowd's angry murmurs faltered as she spoke, uncertainty creeping in. She had evidence, and Phillips knew it. The tension stretched like a bowstring as Anna approached. Phillips' men shifted nervously, looking to their leader. He had to silence her quickly or risk losing everything he'd built. But if he shot her in cold blood while she wore a badge, even his most ardent supporters would question him. The tables had turned in ways he hadn't anticipated. His face contorted as he realized the trap she'd laid. Noah Turner, the telegraph operator who'd helped Anna gather evidence of the land fraud, chose that moment to make his move. Taking advantage of the distraction, he slipped into the store through the back door and began quietly evacuating hostages. Anna kept Phillips's attention focused on her, knowing every second mattered. The future of Prescott hung in the balance of these next few moments. "You're nothing but a traitor and a spy," Phillips spat, his gun hand trembling slightly. "You betrayed your own people during the war." But his words lacked their earlier conviction as more townspeople began viewing the situation differently. They'd known Anna for months as a helpful neighbor who'd invested in their community. The past was the past, many were starting to think. A shot rang out, but not from Phillips. Jacob Perez had returned, and his bullet knocked the gun from Phillips's hand. More riders appeared. Francis had found the cavalry patrol closer than expected. As Phillips's men surrendered, Clara stepped forward again. This time she spoke not to her husband but to the crowd, confirming everything Anna had discovered about the land fraud scheme. In the aftermath, as the setting sun painted the sky in brilliant hues, Anna found herself surrounded not by enemies but by neighbors. Helen hugged her fiercely, while Sheriff Roberts, now conscious, officially announced her position as his new deputy. The war was long over, they agreed. Here in Prescott, they were all just people trying to build something new. Even some former Confederates nodded respectfully as they passed. The land dispute that had nearly torn the town apart would take time to fully resolve. But as Anna pinned on her badge permanently that evening, she knew she'd finally found what she'd been searching for since the war's end. Not just a place to hide, but a community worth fighting for. The past couldn't be changed, but the future was still unwritten. In Prescott, she had a chance to help shape it. As the first light of dawn crept over Prescott's dusty streets, Anna's new deputy badge caught the morning sun. The town was different now, not just in how people treated her, but in the very air they breathed. The revelation of Clara's testimony had shattered old divisions, forcing everyone to confront truths they'd rather have left buried. But peace rarely comes without a price, and Anna knew better than most that some wounds take longer to heal than others. Benjamin, the ringleader of the land scheme, had escaped during the chaos of the previous day's confrontation. Word came from a ranch hand that he'd been seen heading toward Globe, likely gathering what remained of his allies. Anna recognized the pattern. She'd seen it during the war when cornered Confederate units would regroup for one final, desperate strike. Helen insisted on riding with Anna as they tracked Benjamin's group. "You're not alone anymore," she'd said, checking her rifle with practiced ease. Sheriff Roberts, still recovering from his injuries, had given them his blessing and a warning. Benjamin had nothing left to lose. Those were always the most dangerous kind of men. The trail led them through sun-bleached grasslands where cattle grazed lazily beneath an unforgiving sky. Francis, who joined their posse, pointed out fresh hoofprints leading toward an abandoned ranch house that had once belonged to the Yuma Trading Company. The weathered building stood like a skeleton against the horizon, its windows dark and watchful. Inside the ranch house, they found evidence of recent occupation, still warm coffee cups and half-eaten meals. Anna's war-honed instincts screamed a warning just as the first shot splintered the doorframe beside her head. Benjamin and his men had laid a trap, using the building's upper floor for cover. What followed was not the glorified gunfight of dime store novels, but a tense, calculated exchange of fire and strategy. Anna's experience behind enemy lines served her well as she directed Helen and Francis to outflank their opponents. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through broken windows, each movement a dangerous dance between light and darkness. Clara appeared unexpectedly, having followed them from town. Her presence could have complicated things, but instead, she called out to her husband. Her words carried the weight of their shared history, of promises made and broken. "Benjamin, our boy Alexander needs his father alive, not another martyr to a lost cause." The shooting stopped. In the sudden silence, Anna heard the distant lowing of cattle and the wind whistling through prairie grass. Benjamin's voice, when it came, sounded tired. "The war's over, isn't it?" Really over this time. It wasn't really a question, but Anna answered anyway. "It's been over. We just needed time to believe it." The surrender that followed was almost anticlimactic. As Anna secured Benjamin's weapons, she saw in his eyes the same weariness she'd witnessed in countless soldiers, Confederate and Union alike, when they finally laid down their arms. Helen helped Clara tend to her husband's minor wounds, their movements careful but kind. Back in Prescott, the news spread quickly. Sheriff Roberts met them at the jail, his arm still in a sling but his badge polished and proud. The town council would need to sort through the legitimate land claims from the fraudulent ones, but that was work for another day. For now, it was enough that blood hadn't been shed to settle old scores. That evening, as Anna sat on the porch of her small house, Helen brought over a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. The stars emerged one by one above the plains, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate. The war had taught Anna to be a spy, to live in shadows and secrets. But here, in this moment, she was simply herself, a woman who had found her place under these vast western skies. The next morning, Anna would begin the work of being a proper deputy, of helping to build the kind of town where past allegiances mattered less than present actions. But for now, she let herself rest, knowing that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is lay down your burdens and trust in the community you've chosen to call home. The autumn wind swept across the plains outside Prescott as Anna Mitchell watched the approaching riders through her brass spyglass. After 2 days of rising tensions, the inevitable confrontation had arrived. 6 men on horseback, led by Benjamin Turner, were making their way toward her homestead. She recognized the determined set of Turner's shoulders, the same rigid posture he'd maintained during his testimony at yesterday's Land Commission hearing that had granted her official title to the disputed grazing territory. Frances Roberts stood beside Anna on the porch, her face lined with worry. "They won't accept the ruling peacefully, will they?" she asked softly. Both women knew the answer. The commission's decision had inflamed old wounds, not just about the land, but about Anna's wartime past. Turner and his allies viewed her as a traitor who'd betrayed Confederate secrets, leading to devastating Union cavalry raids. That she now held legal claim to prime cattle territory only fueled their outrage. Inside the house, Clara Phillips checked the loading of her Winchester for the third time. The young woman had arrived 2 days ago claiming to be a traveling seamstress, but Anna had quickly recognized the familiar patterns of a Pinkerton operative. The agency was still monitoring potential threats from unreconstructed Confederates, even this far west. Clara's presence was both reassuring and concerning. If the Pinkertons saw danger here, it was real. "They're slowing at the creek crossing," Anna reported, tracking the riders' progress. The morning sun glinted off gunmetal. They'd come armed, as expected. But Anna had spent 4 years gathering intelligence behind enemy lines during the war. She'd learned to read men's intentions in their smallest gestures. Turner's group was hesitating, betraying uncertainty. They wanted to intimidate, not kill, at least not yet. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made all 3 women turn. Jacob Mitchell, Anna's husband of 2 years, was riding hard from town with Noah Roberts and Alexander Perez close behind. The men had been meeting with the sheriff, trying to head off violence before it erupted. Jacob's grim expression suggested they'd had little success. The law would stand aside, letting old grievances play out as they would. "Turner claims you stole Confederate dispatch locations from his father's office in '63, Jacob said as he dismounted. "Says those raids cost hundreds of Southern lives. He won't let this land go without a fight." Anna's jaw tightened. She had indeed taken those documents, but Turner's father had been running guns to guerrilla bands targeting civilian settlements. Sometimes the choices in war were between bad and worse. She'd chosen to stop the killing she could. Frances moved closer to her husband, Noah, who had served in the Union cavalry but harbored no bitterness toward his former enemies. "This isn't about the war anymore," he said quietly. "Turner's ranch is failing. He needs this grazing land or he'll lose everything. The rest is just excuse for what he has to do now." Anna nodded. She'd suspected as much. Desperation was always more dangerous than hatred. Clara stepped onto the porch, rifle held casually but ready. "I have papers from the War Department clearing Mrs. Mitchell of any wrongdoing during her service," she announced, "and affidavits from witnesses about Mr. Turner Sr.'s gun-running operation. How public would you like this to become, Mr. Turner?" she called to the approaching riders. They pulled up short, clearly surprised by her presence and implications. Benjamin Turner's face worked with conflicting emotions as he processed this new threat to his family's reputation. Anna saw the moment his resolve began to crack. She stepped forward, speaking clearly but without confrontation. "I have a proposal, Mr. Turner. This land can support both our herds if we cooperate. Share costs on wells and fencing, coordinate grazing rotation. We all profit instead of fighting." The silence stretched as Turner wrestled with pride and practicality. Finally, he turned to his companions. "My father made his choices in the war. I need to make mine now." Slowly, he dismounted and walked forward alone, hand extended. "Mrs. Mitchell, perhaps we should discuss terms." Around them, the tension began to ease as both sides recognized the gesture for what it was. Not surrender, but the first step toward a new beginning. Anna spent the next hours negotiating a grazing agreement that would preserve both ranches' futures. As the sun set, She watched Turner's group ride away and reflected on how the past never truly released its grip. It just gradually loosened enough to allow something new to grow. Clara departed as well, her mission complete. But she left Anna with a warning that other bitter men might come seeking vengeance for old wounds. That night, as Jacob slept beside her, Anna lay awake listening to the wind. She didn't regret her wartime choices. They'd saved lives on both sides, even if some couldn't see it. But she was grateful that here, on these open plains so far from battlefields and betrayals, there was still room for enemies to become neighbors. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, peace settled over the land like dew, fragile but healing. As spring melted into summer, Anna's ranch flourished under the new agreement. The shared grazing lands between her property and Turner's became a symbol of what was possible when old hatreds gave way to practical cooperation. She often watched the mixed herds grazing together, their different brands a reminder that change came slowly but surely, like water wearing down stone. Jacob proved invaluable in helping implement the arrangement, his steady presence and natural diplomacy smoothing over the inevitable friction points that arose. He never asked about her wartime activities, though she knew he must have heard the whispers. Instead, he focused on building their future, expanding the ranch's operations with careful planning and hard work. Word of the peaceful resolution in Prescott spread through the territory, drawing more settlers looking for a fresh start. Among them came families from both sides of the Mason-Dixon line, drawn by stories of a place where the war's shadows were finally beginning to fade. Anna found herself increasingly called upon to mediate disputes, her reputation for fairness overshadowing her controversial past. But Clara's warning proved prophetic. One dusty afternoon, a writer from Globe brought news that 3 men were asking questions about the spy woman who'd betrayed Confederate positions near Vicksburg. Anna recognized the description of one, Alexander Morton, whose brother had been executed as a spy after her intelligence reports exposed a Confederate smuggling operation. Rather than flee, Anna chose to face the threat head-on. She sent word through Francis, who now ran the general store, that she would meet Morton and his men at the neutral ground of Prescott's church. Jacob insisted on standing with her, though she made him promise to let her handle the confrontation her way. The meeting drew a crowd, though most kept a respectful distance. Morton's face was twisted with grief and rage as he confronted her, demanding to know how she justified her actions. Instead of defending herself, Anna shared the full story she'd never told, how her information had prevented a massacre of both Union and Confederate troops, including Morton's brother, who'd been forced into the smuggling ring against his will. Helen, the preacher's wife who'd lost 2 sons to the war, stepped forward to speak of how Anna had secretly helped her family survive when Confederate authorities would have seized their farm. Others followed, both Union and Confederate sympathizers, telling tales of small kindnesses and quiet heroism that had gone unrecognized during the conflict. Morton's companions drifted away as the stories continued, leaving him alone with his grief. Anna approached him slowly, offering not excuses but understanding. "Your brother was a good man, caught in an impossible situation," she said softly. "I tried to save him, but the war had its own cruel logic. We all carry those we couldn't protect." The moment stretched taut as a wire before Morton's shoulders sagged. He didn't forgive her, some wounds were too deep for that, but he turned his horse toward Globe without violence, leaving Anna with a curt nod that acknowledged their shared pain if not absolution. That evening, as the town gathered for its first community supper, Anna watched former enemies break bread together, while children played nearby, unburdened by their parents' memories. She thought of Clara's words about the past's grip loosening, and realized that perhaps the true victory wasn't in forgetting, but in choosing to build something new from the ashes of what was lost. Noah, Turner's youngest son, brought her a plate of food and sat beside her without awkwardness. They spoke of cattle prices and rainfall patterns, the everyday concerns that bound their community together more surely than any forced reconciliation. Later, as music started up and couples began to dance, Anna saw the future taking shape in the way young people partnered up without asking about their family's wartime loyalties. Jacob found her as the celebrations wound down, his quiet strength a comfort as they walked home under stars that had witnessed both the war's horrors and the peace that followed. "You've helped build something rare here," he said, gesturing to the lights of Prescott glowing behind them. "A place where healing isn't just possible, but expected." Anna squeezed his hand, knowing that while the past would never fully release its grip, Its power to harm diminished with each new day, each small act of reconciliation. The wind still carried echoes of old battles, but now it also brought the promise of spring grass, the laughter of children, and the hope of a future where ancient grudges gave way to new beginnings.